Hi, I'm Stephen McGee. I'm the author of Health Forensics and Hypoxia, Mental Illness and Chronic Fatigue. And that's me. I'm standing on top of the world's largest telescopes, the WM Keck Observatory, on top of Mauna Kea in Hawaii, and that's the Subaru telescope. So we're here today to look into toxic altitude. And that's me, that's the world's largest telescopes, and we have a nice sunny day up there on that picture. And we're going to look into this subject here, acclimatization. So this is page 37 of toxic altitude. So we're going to go through this chapter and we're going to discuss the contents of the chapter. So, acclimatization. The Wikipedia article, Acclimatization, states, acclimatization to high altitude continues for months or even years after initial ascent and ultimately enables humans to survive in an environment that, without acclimatization, would kill them. So, that's kind of important, that sentence right there. So, I'm going to read it back to you. Acclimatization enables humans to survive in an environment that, without acclimatization, would kill them. So acclimatization is super important in human health at high altitudes. So we're up at almost 13,800 feet here. There's 40% less oxygen. Very high radiation environment, and the high radiation is coming from space. That's why the telescopes are there. Humans who migrate permanently to a higher altitude naturally acclimatize to their new environment by developing an increase in the number of red blood cells to increase the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, in order to compensate for lower levels of oxygen intake. Okay, so another super important sentence right there. So, what are we talking about? Red blood cells. So, when you go up here, your body produces an overabundance of red blood cells to compensate the lack of oxygen. So, this is a low oxygen environment. The body is struggling in that environment, and one of the things it does is it makes a massive amount of red blood cells to try and oxygenate the body. So the red blood cells carry oxygen around the body, so that's why it does it. So that article, it's on Wikipedia, it's called Acclimatization. That's a shortened version of it. You can see the full article on Wikipedia. So the next article we're going to look at is the Wikipedia article, Effects of High Altitude on Humans, states, the effects of high altitude on humans are considerable. The oxygen saturation of hemoglobin determines the content of oxygen in the blood. After the human body reaches around 2,100 meters, so that's 6,900 feet, above sea level, the saturation of oxyhemoglobin begins to decrease rapidly. Humans have survived for 2 years at 5,950 meters, which is 19,520 feet, or 475 millibars of atmospheric pressure, which is the highest recorded permanently tolerable altitude. So what this is saying is that people can't live above 19,520 feet. So that is called extreme altitude. So generally extreme altitude, people cannot stay there. If they stay there, they're probably going to die. So this is where kind of people start dying. So you don't find settlements of people at this altitude because nobody can live there. It's virtually impossible. So the highest permanent settlement known La Rinconada is at 5,100 meters, which is 16,700 feet. So we're talking just another maybe 3,000 feet above where I am. So it's about 3,000 feet higher than that. At altitudes above 7,500 meters, that's 24,600 feet, or 383 millibars of atmospheric pressure. Sleeping becomes very difficult. Digesting food is near impossible, and the risk of HAPE or HACE increases greatly. So HAPE is high altitude pulmonary edema. It damages the lungs. So it's one of the nasty side effects of altitude sickness. And it can kill you. Many people have been killed or maimed by HAPE. HACE, it's the same thing but in the brain. So it's high altitude cerebral edema. Again, many people have been killed by HACE. Many people have been maimed by HACE. So these are big killers in high altitude. A lot of people die from these two conditions. So acclimatization, the human body can adapt to high altitude through both immediate and long-term acclimatization. At high altitude, in the short term, the lack of oxygen is sensed by the carotid bodies, which causes an increase in the breathing depth and rate, so hypopnea. So when you go to high altitude, your breathing depth and rate increases greatly. So you're basically panting. And that's done to get oxygen into your body. However, hypopnea also causes the adverse effects of respiratory alkalosis, inhibiting the respiratory center from enhancing the respiratory rate as much as would be required. So this respiratory alkalosis is the chemistry of your body changes. Your body becomes very alkaline up there, and so it's not. There's a lot of changes go on, and this is one of them. This respiratory alkalosis. So all the acidity of the body is changing. Inability to increase the breathing rate can be caused by inadequate carotid body response or pulmonary or renal disease. So if you got kidney damage or lung damage, you're going to be in trouble up at high altitudes because of the responses your body is making to high altitude. So there's a lot of different things happening in the body when you go to high altitude, and it's really bad for people with lung or kidney issues. In addition, at high altitude, the heart beats faster, the stroke volume is slightly decreased, and non-essential bodily functions are suppressed, resulting in a decline of food digestion efficiency as the body suppresses the digestive system in favor of increasing cardiopulmonary reserves. So your body's going into like a fight or flight response when it goes up to these high altitudes, and it's under significant stress. So you're only getting 40% of the oxygen levels up here on top of Mauna Kea at 13,800 feet. And it's doing all kinds of weird things to the body. And one of those is the digestive system. So there's a lot of people on top of Mauna Kea, they're taking digestive medications because their digestive system feels bad. I used to do it, and I can tell you I was routinely taking antacid tablets up there. You start feeling sickly. You feel a little bit like you may vomit. It's a little bit of a horrible feeling. You just start getting like acid reflux and stuff that you didn't have before you went up to the mountain. If you leave the mountain, it subsides, but while you're on the mountain, you have to take antacids to stay there for a lot of people. And the company supplies the antacids for free, as they supply a lot of very diverse over-the-counter medications. And the other ones that these people are taking on Monarchia, typically headache medications, throat lozenges, things to stop the nose from running, and just a general range of tablets that are associated with general sickness. And they become these over-the-counter drug addicts, because the over-the-counter drugs are free up there, as is medical oxygen. So they become addicts to medical oxygen and over-the-counter drugs to try and treat all of this strange adaptation that's taken place to high altitude. So let's carry on. Full acclimatization requires days or even weeks. Okay, I'm going to read that back to you. It's very important about what we're talking about. Full acclimatization requires days or even weeks. Okay, we're going to go into that later. Gradually, the body compensates for the respiratory alkalosis by renal excretion of bicarbonate. So renal excretion of bicarbonate, that may not make sense to some people. So renal is kidneys. So your kidneys are pulling out this bicarbonate and you're urinating it out. So your body is filled up with bicarbonate. It's generally floating around in the blood, and it ends up in the kidneys. It's filtered by the kidneys pull out this bicarbonate and you urinate it out. So this is what's going on in these workers. They're urinating bicarbonate-enriched urine when they're on the mountain. Kind of weird. Not good. So what does this do? Renal excretion of bicarbonate allowing adequate respiration to provide oxygen without risking alkalosis. So this alkalosis, the body chemistry is changing. That's why you're urinating out this bicarbonate. So it's trying to alkalize. So it's going from being acidic to alkaline, and the body is trying to fight it by pouring out this bicarbonate into the urine. So it all sounds very shady, doesn't it? No, it is very shady, and it's not good for human health long term. It takes about 4 days at any given altitude and can be enhanced. Let's go back a little bit. I think we skipped something here. So we're talking about adequate respiration to provide oxygen without risking alkalosis. It takes about 4 days at any given altitude and can be enhanced by drugs such as acetazolamide. So this is a recognized high altitude drug. When I worked in astronomy, it wasn't just this facility. This is Mauna Kea, where we're at on top of Mauna Kea in Hawaii. And I also worked at La Palma in the Canary Islands, and also Kitt Peak in Arizona. So I've worked at 3 complexes of observatories, and I've never seen this drug in the drugs cabinet. I have no idea whether they actually have it. But it's a recognized drug for treating altitude sickness, and as far as I'm aware, it's not on these mountains. Eventually, the body undergoes physiological changes such as lower lactate production, because reduced glucose breakdown decreases the amount of lactate formed. So you can see that there's all kinds of weird stuff going on in the body. So we've got reduced glucose breakdown, and we've got lowered lactate production. So we've got decreased plasma volume, increased hematocrit, which is called polycythemia, increased RBC mass, a higher concentration of capillaries in skeletal muscle tissue, increased myoglobin, increased mitochondria, increased aerobic enzyme concentration, increase in 2,3 BPG, hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, and right ventricle. I'm having a hard job with that one. Ventricular hypertrophy. Pulmonary artery pressure increases in an effort to oxygenate more blood. So this is talking about the artery pressure into the lungs. So the lungs are called pulmonary. So the artery going into the lung increases its pressure. And it doesn't sound very healthy. In an effort to oxygenate more blood. So your body is fighting the lack of oxygen. That's kind of what's going on there. And it changes the pressures in the body to do it. Full hematological adaptation to high altitude is achieved when the increase of red blood cells reaches a plateau and stops. The length of full hematological adaptation can be approximated by multiplying the altitude in kilometers by 11.4 days. For example, to adapt to 4,000 meters, which is 13,000 feet, so we're very close. We're just a little bit short of the height of Mauna Kea. Mauna Kea is at 13,800 at its peak. So this is just a little bit below the peak. Of altitude would require 45.6 days. I'd never heard of that until after I left this field. After I left this field, I got this hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue. It developed on Mauna Kea. I was doing night shifts, and that's when this all started showing up, this hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue. And as I aged, it just became much, much more severe until I became disabled with it. So I had to develop some treatments that are in this book to actually treat it. So once I figured out how it was treated, I improved. But hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue is kind of where this is leading to. So if you have this for a prolonged period, you can go into this state, this hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue. So it takes 45.6 days to acclimatize to 13,000 feet. And I'm probably around 13,600 feet there, so I'm about 600 feet higher. So maybe a few extra days, maybe closer to 50 to acclimatize to the top of Mauna Kea. The upper altitude limit of this linear relationship has not been fully established. Even when acclimatized, prolonged exposure to high altitude can interfere with pregnancy and cause intrauterine growth restriction or preeclampsia. So this is a problem for people who are growing, and particularly like pregnant women. All this high altitude stuff is like really risky for them. High altitude causes decreased blood flow to the placenta, even in acclimatized women, which interferes with fetal growth. Consequently, children born at high altitudes are found to be born shorter, on average, than children born at sea level. So this is a very toxic environment for people in the state of growth. So there's any growth going on. So this is a toxic environment to take children into. Babies, teenagers, that you don't want to be taking them into this environment because it's toxic to them. It's going to cause growth issues. So that article is called Effects of High Altitude on Humans. So we're going to carry on. In professional astronomy, we would yo-yo up and down the mountain daily. So that's here. These mountains, we're going to go through them. I worked on 3 mountains. Let's see what's going on 3 mountains I worked on. So La Palma. So there's a complex of observatories in La Palma. And it's mostly European observatories. It's kind of where Europe is doing its astronomy. It's in La Palma. And La Palma's in the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa. So sea level to mountain summit at 7,861 feet was a 1-hour drive up and a 1-hour drive down. No acclimatization stop. So that's important. So there's 0 acclimatization taking place at this facility for the staff. So they're coming out from around sea level. Some of the staff live around 1,000 feet. Depends. They're generally between sea level and 1,000 feet. The staff, some are maybe a little bit higher in their homes. So they come up from the homes in an hour with no acclimatization stop. Okay. I would sleep atop the mountain several nights per month. So some of the staff are sleeping up there. So they go up there and they're working night shifts and sleeping on the mountain. So there's certainly a group of people up there. There's a hotel up there too, so that's where you sleep. You sleep in the hotel. It's called the Residencia. I developed an aversion to the food at the mountain observatory and started to bring my own food to the facility. So this, I always thought this was strange when it happened, because I just completely went off the food that they served up there. I didn't want to eat there, and I thought their food was absolutely disgusting. It was like school. It's kind of what you'd expect to get at school. It was really lousy food. The compensation in La Palma was you had free wine. So there was free wine on the table. You could drink beer there. So alcohol was flowing freely at this facility. But it had lousy food. The longer I ate there, the more averse I became to the food. I didn't realize that this is actually a known adaptation to high altitude. So this, my first awareness that my body was adapting to high altitude, was my change in taste. I just went off a lot of foods, and I just really didn't understand it at the time. All this, when I was in La Palma from 1999 to 2001, and the internet was pretty useless back then. It was like very immature. You couldn't really look too much up. So all this information on altitude sickness wasn't around. You couldn't research it, and I never really found anything inside of the company that discussed it. So I was very much blind to what altitude sickness did when I was at these facilities, because it just wasn't there on the internet to read about as it is today. So this was the first sign of an adaptation process in me to high altitudes. There was an aversion to food, and that lingered. And I eventually realized that I had food intolerance. So nobody in my family appears to have food intolerance except me. And I have pretty much every food intolerance you can possibly have. So I'm intolerant to protein. I'm intolerant to bread, gluten, milk, and I think there's 4 food intolerances. I forget what the 4th is, but I had all 4 food intolerances, and yeah, that was making me super, super sick, and I didn't know what it was for years, so I couldn't treat it, and neither did my doctors. My doctors didn't understand it. But me, food intolerance just makes me really sick to the point where I become chronically fatigued. So that's kind of where some of this was going on. This hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue talks about it. Okay, so that was La Palma. So we're going to Hawaii. So this is Hawaii, Mauna Kea, summit of Mauna Kea. Let's see what's going on. So I worked 2 jobs at the summit of Mauna Kea. So I started on the day shift. That was the job I was hired in as an electronics engineer. So let's see what's going on the day shift. So sea level to the mountain summit at 13,800 feet was a 2-hour drive up and a 1.5-hour drive down. A half-hour acclimatization stop on the way up, only at 9,200 feet for breakfast. So on the way up, they stopped for breakfast at a place called Halipahaku. And they're there for about half an hour, eating their breakfast. It's very rushed. You literally could not eat breakfast any faster than half an hour. You know, it's like a pig's fest for half an hour when they stop there. It's just like all these people all trying to eat the breakfast as fast as they can in as short a time as they can, because they've got to get up to the mountain. So it's a very rushed breakfast. This is not relaxed. So they call this rushed breakfast acclimatization. Half an hour. Anybody ever heard of a half-hour acclimatization when you go into 13,800 feet? The only place I'm aware of it is high altitude, very high altitude astronomy on top of Mauna Kea. But this half hour is woefully inadequate. And it's the reason why a lot of them go on to develop summit brain on top of the mountain, which seems to be a form of HACE, high altitude cerebral edema. It seems to match very well with that condition. So a lot of these workers, they rush their half-hour breakfast so they can get up and do a full day's work at the WMKEC Observatory, and then as the day goes on, they start getting really sick and have to start using medical oxygen, which is a prescription drug in the USA. Nobody has a prescription. I did not have a prescription. And they're taking all these over-the-counter medications to try and feel better on the mountain so that they can stay there. So it's a very toxic job. So let's see, what's the next thing? Intermittent oxygen use to treat summit brain. So that's what we just talked about. So they don't use continuous oxygen. So the treatment for HACE appears to be continuous oxygen administration. So that's high altitude cerebral edema, which this condition seems to match. And they're doing it with intermittent oxygen. So they queue up for the oxygen cylinders. There's not enough oxygen cylinders up here to treat everybody, so they have to queue for their turn on it with a massive headache. And they breathe oxygen until the headache subsides. So it treats the headache, but it doesn't treat all the other conditions. They're still left with a wide range of conditions after using the oxygen. And they use the over-the-counter drugs to treat those other conditions. Using company-supplied drugs to treat altitude sickness. That's what we just talked about. So it's oxygen and drugs to treat this half-hour acclimatization start that they do. And that's only on the way up. There's no acclimatization on the way down. That's why the drive's faster on the way down. They don't do the half-hour acclimatization on the way down. They go straight from the mountain. They jump into their cars at the mountain. They jump out when they get to the near sea level destination. Change my breakfast on mountain days from the high protein cooked breakfast to high fat ice cream, as I would feel better atop the mountain. So I would sit watching all these workers, and they'd all be pigging out as fast as they could on the very limited time breakfast. I would just walk in, I would get a bowl, and I would go over to the ice cream fridge, and I would help myself to a big bowl of ice cream, because I would feel better on the mountain eating ice cream. So I used to kind of look at the other workers and think, wow, those guys are crazy eating that cooked breakfast. It tastes so disgusting. And then you get on the mountain, you just feel lousy when you've had the cooked breakfast. So I figured out pretty quickly that I felt much better on the ice cream when I was on the mountain. So I was using ice cream as a medication, a digestive medication for going up to Mauna Kea. I was pretty well known for eating the ice cream amongst my co-workers, because I believe I was the only one that was doing that. Everybody else was going for the cooked breakfast, and I was like, are those guys crazy? You feel lousy on the mountain when you eat that cooked breakfast. So I would go up there, and I would feel much better than the rest of the crew because I'd eaten the ice cream. So I was the smart one out of the crew. Okay. So changing your diet can actually help you with these acclimatization issues. Very well known in astronomy, I should say high altitude literature. Generally in mountain climbers, they eat particular diets to try and prevent the sickness from occurring, and I believe it's a carbohydrate diet is what mountain climbers eat. So they have a high carb diet, mountain climbers, to try and offset this altitude sickness. Night shift. So I switched. After about a year and a half, I switched to the night shift. And the reason for that was I actually wanted to work directly with the astronomers. I knew the night shift team well. I used to go to their meetings. I thought it was a pretty cool job. And they also did a week on the mountain, a week off. And I thought the acclimatization would be better. I was starting to get smart around this time to acclimatization. I knew the acclimatization was a better acclimatization than the day shift. So I wanted to get on it for the better acclimatization practice that they had. And I also wanted to get on it so I could work directly with all these astronomers, of which some went on to win the Nobel Prize. So I've worked with some pretty interesting astronomers from around the world. Most of the astronomers that come through the Keck Observatory are USA astronomers, but we do get some international astronomers coming through. And I'm going to drop a name, and some of you will know this name, Andrea Ghez. So I used to work directly with Andrea Ghez, and I would be on the mountain operating the telescope, and she would be down in the control room. I should mention that the astronomers don't go to the mountain, they know it's toxic. So the astronomers have a control room down in Waimea on the Big Island, and it's about 2,700 feet in altitude. So the astronomers got smart years ago and put their control room when they built this place at 2,700 feet. And then they hire these unsuspecting individuals in to work on the mountain and keep them in the dark about how toxic it is. And that's how it goes. They don't train them correctly, and they end up getting sick. And that's, for some of them, they'll go into hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue, as I did. So Andrea Ghez, you're like, who is that? Who is Andrea Ghez? Andrea Ghez won the Nobel Prize, I believe, in physics for her work on black holes, which I was her assistant. So I am somewhat associated with the Nobel Prize. So that's kind of cool. And that was one of the reasons why I moved on to the night shift, because you're just meeting much cooler people on the night shift. And you're getting to interact directly with them. And as a result of that night shift job, I got to know Andrea Ghez very well and her team. And very pleasant group of people they were. But I don't really recall whether I met Andrea Ghez in person. I may have done, because I may have bumped into her while I was down at the office. But I certainly was working directly with her, with me on the mountain, and controlling the telescope, and her in the Waimea office with her team. So that's our name drop for this segment. So let's see what night shift is doing to the WM Observatory workers. Extreme night shifts that start before sunset and finish after sunrise. So what's an extreme night shift? I mean, my memories of this extreme night shift is they can be like 16 to 18 hours long in the middle of winter when the night is its longest. So winter, everybody hates the winter on the night shift team because it makes the night shift super long. So the night shifts are shorter in summer and the longer in winter on top of Monarchy. And it's extreme. You feel lousy. Right around midnight, you just want to go to bed. And then the rest of the night is spent fighting that tiredness. It's just it's a very unpleasant state to be in. And that's kind of where all this started onsetting, was this hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue. Because the night shift workers, in an effort to try and stay awake, they tend to be taking some extra drugs that the day shift don't do. And they tend to be sleeping tablets and stimulants. So, yeah, there's a lot of drug use going on the night shift in some workers up there. Certainly that was the case with me. I was certainly on sleeping tablets and stimulants. So you have to do that to do this extreme night shift work, because it's virtually impossible without it. The night shift's so long. It's just an absolutely atrocious night shift. Probably the worst night shift I'm aware of, because you're doing it at 13,800 feet. You're having to use medical oxygen, you're having to use over-the-counter drugs, you're having to use stimulants, and you're having to use sleeping tablets. So that makes you very, very, very sick, and you end up in this hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue state. And I may have brought on a tumour. I had a knee tumour removed in my right knee, and that triggered harassment from the Keck Observatory. They were harassing me for my voluntary resignation. I got taken into these lone HR meetings where the management team would gang up on me and harass me for my voluntary resignation. They would talk about the fact that I'd had the audacity to use my sick time to have a tumour removed from my knee, which, had it stayed in there, I probably would have lost my leg, and it may have actually killed me. So that's how sickness works on the night shift at the WM Observatory. Very unpleasant experience. So let's carry on with our list. Residing for a week at 9,200 feet. So this place is called Halipahaku. Halipahaku is basically a hotel for the workers. It's at 9,200 feet, which is at high altitude. So you still get high altitude sickness there, and it brings on sleep apnea. So you get a horrible day of sleep down there. It's very difficult to sleep down there, and the sleep you do get, it's not refreshing. So every day you're on the mountain, you just get more and more exhausted because you're not sleeping well. So they're commuting daily from 9,200 feet to 13,800 feet in half an hour each way. So this change from 9,200 to 13,800 happens in half an hour, twice a day for them. So they go up, they do the shift, and then they come down. And there's no acclimatization stop in there, and they're going from high altitude to very high altitude sickness. So this is the cross between where altitude sickness becomes much, much more severe. So yeah, that's why you get really sick up there, because you're not in altitude sickness, you're in very high altitude sickness. So intermittent oxygen use to treat summit brine. So they're getting summit brine and they're using oxygen. I was extensively using oxygen up there to try and stay awake and to treat the summit brine. Using company-supplied drugs to treat altitude sickness. Using stimulants to stay awake. Using sleeping tablets during sleep at 9,200 feet. So we need to talk about that because most medical professionals will tell you not to use sleeping tablets at 9,200 feet because you generally have central sleep apnea. And sleep apnea can kill you. So, and that's particularly so if you put sleeping tablets in on top of it, because the sleeping tablets depress your body and make you more prone to stop breathing. So sleep apnea stops you from breathing during sleep, so you start gasping for breath. And then you put sleeping tablets in it, on top of it, makes it even worse. So it aggravates sleep apnea. So I believe that's kind of what happened in me, and it's probably why I started developing a tumor in my knee. It was probably coming out of sleep apnea, the central sleep apnea, and the sleeping tablets causing hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue to develop in the body, which manifested itself as a tumor in my knee. Insufficient time for adequate sleep between winter night shifts. So you can't get 8 hours sleep. You can't get 8 hours of good sleep in between these night shifts. It's virtually impossible because you're at 9,200 feet trying to sleep with central sleep apnea and your sleeping tablets. So you end up, anybody who's used sleeping tablets will tell you feel super groggy when you wake up, and that grogginess lasts all day. So you end up being in this like groggy sleep tablet withdrawal state when you're doing your night shift, and it's super, super unpleasant. My memories of this job on the night shift was a nightmare. I was able to tolerate it for about a year, and then it was all downhill from there as all these conditions started kicking in, and I eventually ended up with a tumor in my knee. That's what prompted me to leave. So, are the above called acclimatization or malacclimatization? So what's the difference? So they're all called malacclimatization. It takes 28 days to fully acclimatize the blood to 7,861 feet in La Palma. So this is La Palma. It takes 28 days to acclimatize. They go up there in just 1 hour. So there's no acclimatization taking place in La Palma. So it's malacclimatization in La Palma. And it takes 48 days at 13,800 feet in Hawaii. So right here, it's 48 days. So I believe I said it was about 50. So according to their formula, it's 48 days at 13,800 feet in Hawaii. So that's this location. So that's malacclimatization right there. You're looking at it. There is virtually zero acclimatization in this person standing on top of the world's largest telescopes at the WMKEC Observatory. So what happens to workers that stay in a constant state of malacclimatization? Many of them end up sickly, some develop diseases, and for others they die prematurely. So there's a growing list of dead people at the WMKEC Observatory, and we can debate how much of that has come out of the toxic lifestyle, but the standard thing for the company to do is to deny everything with lawyers. So their lawyer rep, if you put in for your workers' compensation, their lawyer rep, and you'll be interacting with lawyers regarding your workers' compensation for the damage they've done to you. And the lawyers will win because the system is set up for the lawyers to win. They don't give you a lawyer. So you're a lone person, sick, disabled, you need a lawyer, they don't give you one, but there's no shortage of money for the company lawyers. So they lawyer up with a law company, and they do their very best to deny you your workers' compensation. And the disability system is very much the same. You go through the disability system, the USA disability system, you're fighting a lawyer that's employed by the US government to deny you your disability benefits. And the statistics show that those lawyers are very successful with denying disability and workers' compensation benefits. So I never got any disability benefits, I never got any workers' compensation, despite having all this malacclimatization disease in my body and all this drug use disease and oxygen use disease, and it's just very toxic, super toxic location. And there's been a bunch of people died in that telescope, and there's been a lot more went to hospital. The whole place went on fire. So yeah, this telescope has a sad history. It's called the Subaru telescope. So very, very famous for killing people, that telescope. So mountain climbers only ascend 1,500 feet per day above 10,000 feet. So the people who are smart about acclimatization, not professional astronomers, it's the mountain climbers. So the mountain climbers understand this subject very well. And all of this falls outside of established mountain climbing protocols. So I don't know who came up with these acclimatization procedures in professional astronomers. It probably was the professional astronomers themselves. And they don't seem to have used established acclimatization procedures from the mountain climbing community to develop these acclimatization procedures. And they're not using the drugs that the mountain climbers use either. They're using over-the-counter medications. And there's actually specific drugs in the mountain climbing community that mountain climbers climb with and take if they get sick on top of the mountain. So if they start getting the summit brain, they'll start taking medications to treat it. So I've never seen those mountain climbing medications on the mountain. So mountain climbers only ascend 1,500 feet per day, above 10,000 feet. So it's a very different acclimatization going on in mountain climbers. So let's see how we would mountain climb to Mauna Kea. So using the mountain climbing protocol, it would take 5 days to reach the 13,800 feet summit of Mauna Kea. So day one, you would go up from sea level to 5,000 feet, and you would stay at 5,000 feet that night. So day two, your mountain climber, he goes from 5,000 feet to 10,000 feet, and he stays the night at 10,000 feet. So day three, he goes from 10,000 feet to 11,500 feet. So he's only gone up 1,500 feet at that point. So he's only at 11,500. So he's a couple of thousand feet short of this location right now on day three. So on day four, he goes from 11,500 feet to 13,000 feet. He's still not here. He's still not at the summit where these telescopes are. So day five, he goes from 13,000 feet to 13,800 feet to this location. So your mountain climber takes 5 days to get to this location. Very, very different acclimatization technique. So there's a big question going on in professional astronomy, and that is, why are they using distinctly different acclimatization techniques in their staff? And the reason why mountain climbers do this is it's come out of over 100 years of research on altitude sickness. This is over 100 years of altitude sickness that's drawn up this table. And it's done to prevent altitude sickness in the mountain climber. So everybody on this mountain gets altitude sickness. I've never seen a person not develop it. So as far as I'm aware, everybody at the WM Observatory, using the WM Observatories acclimatization protocols, the medical oxygen, and the over-the-counter drugs, everybody's getting sick, and they're all using those drugs to stay there. So the treatment is, at this point, when you develop the sicknesses, you descend. Nobody descends. They just stay there the whole time in a sickly state. Okay, so let's wrap this up. So when I started becoming aware my co-workers were becoming diseased and some were dying, prematurely dying, I knew something was wrong in professional astronomy. So that's when I started getting wise about this hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue, and the toxic altitude. And I started writing these books about what's going on in these world-class observatories. And I started getting wise that there's some really shady stuff going on in these telescopes. So yeah, I've got a growing list of co-workers who've become diseased, and there's a growing list of dead co-workers that I personally know, and I don't know the full list. I only know a partial list of what I'm aware of. I'm sure the list is much larger. So I'm going to read that paragraph back to you, just so you can digest it. So, when I started becoming aware my co-workers were becoming diseased and some were prematurely dying, I knew something was wrong in professional astronomy. So that's the book, Toxic Altitude. It's a big discussion about altitude sickness in professional astronomy workers, if you're a pilot or cabin crew on an airplane, mountain climber, high altitude hiker, you're doing any kind of job that takes you to high altitude. Truck driver in the USA may take you to high and very high altitudes. I recommend you read this book. It may answer some of the questions regarding your health issues. So it's Toxic Altitude. This one talks about what happens to people who've gone into long-term effects of high altitude sickness. So this is hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue. Probably a good read for people with COVID-19, because COVID-19 is a hypoxic sickness. And Health Forensics is a good read, because it talks about what I was looking into with my health prior to making the links across to the Toxic Altitude. Please like the video. Please subscribe, and I wish you the very best of health. Thank you.